Okay, everybody. This is MiraCosta College, Week 9. These two chapters are gonna be out of the Reeves book. So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna talk about World War II, and then we're gonna talk about the Cold War. All right, and some of the things that come out of that. So obviously, World War II is one of the more famous wars that we've had. Probably considered to be the last just war. It lasted from 39 to 1945. Involved the Allies and the Axis. Here are a list of the Allies: Britain, France, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, India, the Soviet Union, China, and the United States. And as we know, the Axis powers were Germany, Japan, and Italy. So, how did the United States eventually get involved in the war? So, Hitler came to power in Germany. We were coming right out of the Great Depression, and there was a lot of economic turmoil in Germany. So, Hitler promised to fix the economic problems that the Weimar Republic caused, and kind of restore national pride after their defeat in World War One. So in November of 1936, they signed an anti-communist pact with Germany and Japan and Italy all clumped together. FDR originally did not want to get into the war, right? Um, Even though kind of the persecution of the Jewish religion and them being scapegoats in many countries was widely deplored here in the U.S. But we still kind of sought to seek an isolationist position here during the war. Um, and one interesting statistic is in 1937, 94% of the people here in the U.S. favored some type of isolationism. And even when the Japanese sank the American gunboat, the USS Panay in Chinese waters, people still wanted to remain isolationist, even though and as a top of that, Japan apologized and took steps that appeared to signal a desire of peace. One thing that also came out of this time was something called called the Ludlow Amendment. The Ludlow Amendment was a proposal to amend the Constitution, which called for a national referenda um, anytime there was a declaration of war that needed to be made by Congress, the United States people, as citizens, would be the ones to determine whether or not the U.S. would engage in a war. It was actually 21 votes short of passing, so just kind of a little bit of history about that. The Axis powers started to gain momentum. Hitler annexed Austria and then took over a large part of Czechoslovakia. Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia and then Franco out of Spain, Mussolini out of Italy, and the Japanese under Hirohito were also on the march. In May, Germany and Italy started a military alliance, which formed the Axis. On the first day of September in '39, Germany invaded Poland, right? And at that time, the UK and France had pledged to support Poland and declared war 2 days later. At the time, the American army only had 174,000 soldiers, which was ranked at 17th in the world. By comparison, in the Nazi Party, the Germans had 12 million soldiers. So the war quickly spread through Europe. In the spring of 40, the Nazi troops rolled through Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and France, kind of using a type of blitzkrieg war or lightning war. For those of you that are football followers, this is where the term blitz comes from on the defense. The defense rushes the quarterback. This is kind of the same thought with war. Send everybody at an individual or an individual platoon or whatever, and then you can take them over pretty easily. Great Britain, who was the next target after France, was soon fighting for its life, and as kind of a tradition with the United States and Britain, FDR decided to aid Britain by trading ships to them. The Japanese also moved into stricter positions in northern French Indochina, which is current-day Vietnam, in September, and they signed an alliance treaty with Germany and Italy. Even though the U.S. was still strong, they were still strong with their isolationist beliefs, especially among German and Irish ethnic groups here in the United States, college students and Republicans at the time. So in 1941, Roosevelt asked for the authority to lend and lease $7 billion worth of war supplies, which he deemed to be necessary for the defense of the United States. He sought to make the America the arsenal of democracy. As a result, we started to send aid to Great Britain, and the United States was clearly on the sides of the Allies at this time. In June of 1941, Hitler violated his alliance with Joseph Stalin and attacked the Soviet Union. The Third Reich, and Hitler's pledge was to take over Europe. Both the British and American governments promised to help to resist aggression, and $1 billion in aid was on its way to Britain. On September 4th of 1941, the destroyer USS Greer was attacked by a German submarine that was tracking off the coast of Iceland. As a result, FDR declared that American ships would shoot on sight all German submarines found between Iceland and North America. This leads us to, kind of the full involvement that the United States had in this war. In July of 41, the Japanese moved into southern Indochina. And continuing to hope the economic pressure would restrain Japan, FDR decided to freeze all Japanese assets that were in the United States, virtually ending trade agreements between the two nations and making Japan very upset. The Dutch governor of the East Indies also cut off Dutch oil to Japan, and this was pretty much kind of the tipping point and the event that spurned the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor. As a result of the Dutch governor of the East Indies cutting off Dutch oil to Japan, they decided to plan a surprise attack on the United States. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, George Marshall, who was a chief of staff general at that time, sent a warning based on an intercepted code to Hawaii and several other locations. The telegram to Hawaii was delayed after its arrival, and it didn't get to Pearl Harbor until after the Japanese had started to attack Pearl Harbor, which was the home of the Pacific Fleet. In total, 21 American warships were sank, 165 planes were destroyed, and 2,338 military personnel and civilian personnel were killed. The sinking of the Arizona took the lives of 1,177 crewmen. If you ever have a chance to visit Hawaii and see Pearl Harbor, there is a memorial for the Arizona, and they still haven't raised that ship. It's still at the bottom of Pearl Harbor, and the sailors are entombed in that ship still. They never raised them up. It's called the Day of Infamy, December 7th, 1941. On the home front, people started to contribute. We were coming out of the Great Depression. People were contributing car parts used to produce ammunitions. Earnings grew by 70% during the war. We had actually a manpower shortage that was hastened by the draft and the need for defense workers, which led to a lot of women going into the workforce for the very first time. In wartime, employment peaked more than 12.5 million people in basic war industries. So if we kind of look at the numbers, and we've had the Selective Service Act already passed during this time, and at that time there was about 11 million people that were drafted into World War II. At that time, we already had about 6 million volunteers, and then we had 11 million people that were drafted. Our economy also grew as a result of this. The government purchased goods and services, which reached $89 billion in 1944, and again, this is 1944 dollars, and then we started to see corporate profits rise also. And like I said, women started to work outside the household. We had 36% of all women were in the workforce, up from 28% in 1940. Minorities also played a big role in World War II. African Americans continued to be discriminated against, and even in the military. But as Hitler was attacking Great Britain and the Soviet Union, simultaneously he threatened to take over all of Europe. His post on the Atlantic posed a danger to the Western Hemisphere. Italy eventually collapsed and surrendered in 1943. Mussolini was drove for power, and he was quickly executed by the Italian people. So one thing about the Holocaust, and we kind of understand things about the Holocaust. The Allied powers were aware of the Jewish Holocaust 2.5 years earlier than it is generally assumed. In 1944, there are secret documents that showed the UN knew of the concentration camps all the way back to 1942. So that's kind of an interesting thing when we had this information and nothing was really acted upon. So one of the turning points in World War II was the D-Day invasion, and we're talking about in the European theater right now, right? So the Germans had breached France, also were moving toward Great Britain, but the English Channel prevented the Germans from moving supplies into England. We had something called the Battle of Normandy on Omaha Beach in France, and this is one of the most violent and bloodiest battles that we've had in World War II, which resulted with the United States pushing the Germans out of France back into Germany and back into Central and Eastern Europe. The surprise attack involved nearly 3 million men, 4,000 landing craft, 600 warships, and some 11,000 aircraft. At this time, the deaths by the Allies were horrendous, especially among Americans at Omaha Beach. And I think we've mentioned Saving Private Ryan in class before and talked about it. And the first 20 minutes of Saving Private Ryan really details the invasion of Omaha Beach really, really well. So on July 25th, following kind of the devastating air bombardment, the army broke through the German lines. Paris was liberated, and the Allies headed toward the Rhine River. By October, the Americans were on German soil, and on May 7th, 1945, Germany officially surrendered to the Allies, bringing an end to the European conflict in World War II. Now, remember, we also had another theater in the Pacific, right? The Japanese had taken over Pearl Harbor, had attacked Pearl Harbor, taking Guam, Wake Island, and Hong Kong in December, and Singapore and Java in 1942. The Marines landed in Guadalcanal, which is an island in the Pacific, in 1942, and a fierce struggle occurred lasting 6 months before the Japanese conceded defeat. The Allies invaded Marshall Island, the Admiralty Islands, Hollandia, New Guinea, the Mariana Islands, the Palos Islands, and the Philippines. In October, the massive Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines actually gave control of the Pacific to the Allies. The Japanese losses were severe. Over 50,000 Japanese died in the effort to retain the Mariana Islands. Fighting on the tiny Pacific islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa in the winter and spring of 1945 kind of showed and kind of gave a foretelling of how bloody the invasion of Japan would be. The Marines suffered about 20,000 casualties at Iwo Jima before 4 Marines, in an iconic photo, raised the American flag on Mount Suribachi, and this is a picture of it. Eventually, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, in August of 1945, which ultimately led to the Japanese surrender. So the war killed about 322,000 Americans and injured about 800,000. More people died in Europe. Russia lost perhaps 26 million people. And close to 15 million people died in the Holocaust. All right, so we're going to pick up on this next lecture video talking about the Cold War. Okay, we'll see you in a bit.